Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Utah Stories program. My name is Richard Marcosian. Today on the program, a conversation with farmer Jack Wilbur. So he's both a PR representative for the Utah State Department of Agriculture, and he is a full-time farmer. So how does one guy have two full-time jobs? Easy. Jack works 80 hours a week. It's unbelievable. He's a full-time farmer with several plots throughout Salt Lake City. He grows for markets, and he's been doing that for like 30 years. And it's a very fun conversation about farms, agriculture, growing practices. If you're a backyard gardener, you're going to like some of the growing practices and techniques for learning organic growing and how I became a convert to organic growing. It was a very fun conversation. So without further ado, Jack Wilbur. Okay, Jack Wilbur, thanks for being on the program. Appreciate it.
Well, yeah, thank you for having me.
So today I wanted to talk about the whole idea of why local farms are important and why the idea of local food reliance and sustainability is important. And so how long have you been a farmer, first of all?
Well, see, I've been doing it actively for about 20 years since I married into the family that had a little farm in Bountiful. And my father-in-law will celebrate his 81st year on that land later this year. His family had a farm in Salt Lake County, and they moved up to Davis County in 1939, I believe it was. 38, yeah.
And that's when he started?
And he was 9 years old, started farming as he had jobs in the orchard and with the animals, and he's been farming ever since.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so you, what kind of things do you farm, and how do you make it work on your farm?
So we're a little different. We're kind of a hybrid of some of these very small urban farms and then some of the little bit larger farms. We have a few acres of tree fruit that we grow in Davis County, and then we also lease a couple of fields in Salt Lake County, and we farm in 4 yards. I wanted to say backyards. One of them is actually a front yard, and 3 of them are backyards just in the city, in Salt Lake City. And they're not very large spaces, but there we do a lot of stuff compressed into a small space. So we do a lot of crops that you can do quick rotations, 2 or 3 crops in a season, and then turn around and do it again in the fall, kind of a thing. So we have some places that we're on our 3rd growth of radishes this year already, and then we'll stop growing radishes there, rest it a little while, and then put some in for the fall, and then next year we'll move those to a different part of the garden or a different garden. But we really do a lot of intense stuff there, but then we do some of the more spread out type of agriculture as well.
And so the idea and the whole practice of backyard urban gardening, that's grown quite a bit because we are just running out of space.
Right.
That's close to the city. So you've basically found that that's a good viable way to practice agriculture and get what you need produced.
Yeah, it really is. There are a lot of pieces of ground still available. People with just large backyards or whatever that might look like, where if somebody knows what they're doing, they can really grow a lot of food in a small space. And I think that's been the trend over the last 10 or 15 years. You've seen a lot of these micro farms, inner city, urban type farms popping up. We have some friends, Tyler and Holiday, with Keep It Real Vegetables. They grow exclusively on other people's land in backyards, 10 different gardens they're in. Jeez. And that's what they do. And it's less than 1 acre, but they do very well for themselves. They were able to sustain a business and a lifestyle doing that. And so it's hard work. It's all manual labor. As you can imagine, you're not using tractors on those kinds of spaces to do some of your work for you, but it seems to work.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and then I think one of the next trends is going to be, now how do you do it with essentially no garden space or no land? And You have to have something, but what I'm referring to is maybe like aquaponics and hydroponics in freight cars or in warehouse space. So repurposing land that had been used for something completely different that wasn't even agriculture and making it be agriculture, doing it a different way, like growing in water.
I saw a company that is offering a shipping container,
Mm-hmm.
and they'll set up a whole system with misters where you can do like microgreens and trays of microgreens in shipping containers.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing where you can do that, and others do shipping containers, but they'll do them in more traditional hydroponics where you can grow lettuces and kale and basil and other herbs and those kind of things. And as you can imagine, shipping containers don't have windows, so you're using LED lighting, artificial lighting to create your growth environment, and you're not using dirt, you're using water and growth mediums, sometimes sponges, sometimes cocoa fiber kind of things. But it's really quite amazing because basically you need water, you need nutrients, you need light, but you don't necessarily need soil to grow in. So that may be the next big trend, especially as we're losing that land. And now the farms that are being developed into subdivisions now, they're mostly homes and very little land around them, and so you're not going to be borrowing those people's backyards and growing very much in 15 or 20 or 30 years. And so you've got to go somewhere if you're going to keep growing food locally.
Well, I mean, this kind of goes back to my question. It's like you look at how amazing our soil is, where farmers are growing, and I had this conversation with Alan Bengerter last year. It takes years to develop the fertility of the soil and to know how to adequately do that without using tons of fertilizer, to do it in a more organic way. Why isn't farming considered the highest and best use of that land? Why are we building over the top of so much of our best farmland in Utah?
Well, I think it comes down to money, to be honest with you. I mean, I really don't know the answers and what motivates people completely, but when you think about what a piece of ground is worth to develop it and make multiple use or very space intensive development like condos or very small home lots, you can make a lot more money right now and then move on to the next piece of property and make a lot of money on that piece of property. But imagine what it's like to farm that ground. And a lot of farmers, especially like the larger scale farmers that grow hay or small grains, they're making $1,000, $1,500, $2,000 a year an acre on that land. Mm-hmm. And those of us that are doing intense vegetables are making more money per acre, but most of us are doing it on smaller acreage. And so you're not competing with the amount of money you could make from that land by developing it. But the problem is it's a one-time use, it's developed, and then of course the homeowners and people need a place to live, and that's legitimate, but now it's land that becomes people's houses and their yards and their driveways. It's no longer usable for vegetables. So when you talk about the higher and best use, I think some people tend to focus on the money part of it. But as communities, we need to maybe start thinking about what are those other higher and best uses, like keeping road miles down by growing food locally and fewer fossil fuels being burned and those kinds of things.
Yeah,
so,
just being close to where your food is being produced,
and
that seems to make a lot of sense to me in terms of, not being so dependent upon fossil fuels, because if it's taking, if your lettuce is shipped 1,200 miles from Mexico to end up in the grocery store, all the inefficiencies of that model are huge and so dependent upon gas prices.
Right, exactly. And and I'm not a historian, but I from what I know and what I've read, if you look at where we were as a country after World War II, when we had a nice surplus of oil and we had tire and rubber and we had all the great technologies like those inorganic fertilizers, we had all these great inputs and we needed stuff to do with it, and it made sense perhaps at that time to kind of industrialize our food system and to ship things long distances. And now all of a sudden, instead of an orange being a treat that you got in your Christmas stocking, you could have an orange all year round because it was so inexpensive to get it to the grocery store and to bring it from various climates where it grows different times a year. But then in the past 70 years, or 80 years since the end of World War II, things have changed. And now we're to the point where, fuel costs are very high, and our air quality is not very good with all the additional people that live here. And so it maybe makes some more sense. But, even beyond those kinds of reasons, I think it makes sense from sort of a cultural standpoint, because you can get your lettuce from 1,200 miles away, or you can get it from a couple of miles away, and you may still just go to the farmer's market and not really experience the farm. But if that lettuce is growing 2 miles away or 10 miles away, you might have that opportunity to go visit that farm. You could go see where it is growing and have your kids actually touch and, pick stuff and be there. And not every farm is set up to be able to have a bunch of visitors all the time, kind of thing. And that's fine, but those opportunities exist with local, and they certainly don't exist if the food is only coming from 750, 1,000, 1,500 miles away.
Yeah, and I think that, so I've gotten into reading from this farm writer, Wendell Berry. I'm sure you probably heard of him. And he wrote an essay about the idea of a local economy and the idea of local farms. And I want to read you a quote from it that I liked. He says, he's talking about people in a local economy, and he says, how are they able to protect themselves? There seems really to be only one way, and that is to develop and put into practice the idea of a local economy, something that growing numbers of people are now doing for several good reasons. They're beginning with the idea of a local food economy. People are trying to find ways to shorten the distance between producers and consumers, to make the connections between the two more direct, and to make this local economic activity a benefit to the local community. They're trying to learn to use the consumer economies of local towns and cities to preserve the livelihoods of local farm families and farm communities. They want to use the local economy to give consumers an influence over the kind and quality of their food, and to preserve the land and enhance the local landscapes. And I think that kind of goes back to everything you talked about. It's like
Right.
the local landscape. Why isn't it a priority that we have those green spaces where kids can see, oh, wow, there's a farm. That's where my food's grown. And to actually have this sort of connection with our source of food. And because it just seems like the state leaders don't place any value. I mean, I'm talking about the governor's office in general, that they don't place enough value on just having those green spaces and that green belt in our areas.
Well, I really can't speak to that. What the policies or what's on the minds of the state legislature or the governor's office. But one thing I do know is that at the very local level, there's been a couple of interesting examples of trying to infuse some of that local agriculture back into the landscape and the environment and the economy and all of those things. Utah County is one of those examples. They came up with an agricultural toolbox a few years ago with things in it like ways to maybe put cluster farms in agricultural protection areas, and then cluster development around them or in other places. I know that Layton City right now is working on their zoning master plan for their development master plan for the next however many years they do that for. And they realize that a lot of those farms on the west side of Layton are going to get sold, and that's all free market economy. People have the right to sell out if there's nobody else in the family that wants to run it, and that's their right and their choice.
Yeah, you can't disparage that if
No,
that's somebody's decision.
You can't do anything about that.
I've thought about that and covered it.
Yeah.
And if there's 12 siblings who all own 10 acres, you can't tell every sibling, oh, you're not going to get your money, but we'll preserve it as a farm.
Right, but we'll continue to be able to earn $1,500 an acre every a year, every year of your life. And a lot of people are going to say, well, no, that doesn't really work.
Yeah, there's
you
really
know, for me.
there's really no great mechanism in place to allow for that. I mean,
Right, but what Layton City has is looking at doing is they're looking at providing some credits to developers if they're, let's say, for example, they develop a 10-acre parcel. They're looking at giving them some density credits so they can put the homes on smaller lots closer together.
Yeah, I've heard about
and then
that.
they have some open space requirements to get those credits. To be able to put more lots on your 10 acres, you'd have to have a nice park or something here. But then the other thing they're looking at is small plot intensive agriculture as part of it. So you might have lost that 10 acres of that used to be farm ground, but maybe they'll be able to keep an acre or an acre and a half of it to be somebody's farm that the a homeowner association leases out to a farmer to use. And that's a really innovative kind of concept. And we're seeing more of those sort of innovative concepts because you and I are not alone in this discussion. There's a lot of people that are saying we want to preserve some of our agriculture at least.
Yeah.
And I think the other part of preserving agriculture is understanding and respecting the different types of agriculture that go on. And so some of the agriculture in this state feeds into a more regional, national, or even global system, and has to be part of that. And so you see a lot of the beef producers have to ship most of their animals at a certain weight to be finished in another part of the country. There are people buying our hay, our alfalfa, all over the world, and so being part of a global economy, I think, as long as that global economy exists, I believe that's something that farmers are going to need to do. If they're the right type of farmers and at the right scale, that's something they need to do. But I do think that we need to make room for and preserve some of this small scale, very local agriculture for all of the reasons we've discussed.
Yeah, and I actually do love that idea of creating density credits to a developer because it's just so quickly disappearing, that farmland that used to be all along Highway 89 and the fruit corridor, and you're just seeing like every couple of blocks there's a big plot for sale. And we traveled to the UK, and I was there off and on for a year, and this development we were in was in Cambridgeshire. And it was a huge, massive development that they had finished building out, but it was a former orchard, and it was like 300 acres, and they made it extremely dense. Like most of the homes were really narrow townhouses, and a lot of the homes had either just a little tiny backyard or no backyard at all. But then you had this huge nature preserve with a lot of the orchards still in place. And then everybody could go out and enjoy, something that it feels like a farm, and then parts of it were leased out to farmers, and it was done on a really massive scale. Has that ever been considered in Utah that you know of, or for bigger farms that they want to develop?
I'm not aware of anything like that in Utah, but I know that there are places in the country that have tried to do more of that model. Like, for example, in New York City, they've spent a lot of money trying to help keep land in farms up in the Hudson Valley, and a lot of that was for water quality purposes, so that they would have drinking water sources that were clean or cleaner. But whatever their motivation and their reasoning, they've tried to, number one, I mean, the city and the boroughs are all pretty tightly packed and clustered, but they try to put money into keeping farms going in the upper watershed area, so that you don't end up with all that sprawl like we've done here in Utah and California and a lot of places throughout the country. So that's a slightly different model than what you're talking about, but it's the same kind of concept.
Yeah.
They're try to keep the development where the development is and cluster it in and get it as tightly packed as possible and keep the open spaces as open as possible. But you also have people that don't want to live in a very tightly packed area and they want to have a little bit of a country feel, but they don't really want to, grow food actively and be farmers. And so, there are different, I think there's just different ideas out there. And I think as long as you have a free market economy, whoever has the money is going to drive that, and then so there are going to be different models of growth. But I would like to see more of that. And I know as I mentioned earlier, Utah County with their agricultural toolbox, they're looking at more cluster development as well. And I think the more of that you can do, the more opportunity there is for some of this farming. And I think you can see that, like for example, in my father-in-law's generation, he'd say, well, there's just no money in farming. And it's true, under certain models you have to have a lot of acreage to really make a living and do well. But now a lot of things have changed, and a lot of those models have changed over time, where, like back to the guy with the freight car or the warehouse, you can make money farming on a very small piece of ground if you do it right, if you grow vertically, if you do a lot of quick crop rotations and intercropping and those kind of things. And so there are ways to do it. The question is, have we figured all of that out, and have we started to grow a new generation of young people wanting to farm? Is it all happening too late for a lot of us here in the Salt Lake Valley and on the Wasatch Front? Are we to the point where we've just overdeveloped to the point where we're not going to be able to continue to save those spaces and do that? I don't know the answer to that, but I certainly hope there will continue to be farming in Salt Lake Valley, Salt Lake City.
Yeah.
And,
well,
all
it
through
seems
the
like
Wasatch
the number of farmers markets that exist now, even compared to just 10 years ago, I think there was something like 10 years ago, and now I think there's something like 85 farmers markets, and just the push of restaurants wanting to call themselves farm to table. It's like this whole local food movement seems to be really growing, and I guess my question is there, with that desirability of the consumer, wanting to have more farm fresh produce, locally grown food, are there any more mechanisms in place that help farmers to be able to provide what the consumer wants? Or is it ultimately just a question of, if real estate prices and land prices continue to go up and up, people are just going to do whatever's the most profitable?
Yeah, there really aren't a lot of resources that I'm aware of to really keep land in farming. Utah Open Lands is a private organization that has preserved a lot of open space for various purposes, including agriculture, as well as trails and wetlands and those kind of things. But there's not really I don't know that there are very many programs like that. I don't know that there's a really big push still with that. But I think that you're seeing more and more people wake up to the idea of, hey, we want to preserve some agriculture in Utah. Yeah. So maybe as time goes on, you'll see more of that happening.
Maybe the same people attending the farmers markets need to be a little more proactive about what can we do in our own community and preserve the farms that are here.
And I know, for example, I don't think they have it off the ground yet, but I know there's a program that up in the Box Elder County area that the Bear River Land Conservancy organization is looking at working with a few select retailers to do a checkout program where you round up to the next dollar. So let's say you spent $21.55. Well, sir, would you like to round up that last 45 cents to help preserve agriculture? And the money then goes into a fund that is managed by a board of trustees that then helps pay ranchers and farmers for the development rights of their farm and give them a little bit of a nest egg, a retirement, and at the same time put that in a conservation easement and keep that land protected in agriculture. And so something like that. I have no idea how well it'll take off,
Mm-hmm.
and if so, how long it would take to raise enough money to actually be able to buy some of these things out. But one thing you have to think about a little bit is a lot of the farmers, especially the older farmers, maybe didn't really have aggressive 401ks, and farming doesn't have a pension plan.
Mm-hmm.
And so many of these folks, especially if they don't have younger generations that want to or can take on the farm, that's their retirement.
Yeah.
It's that old adage of cash poor but land rich.
Yeah.
And so you can't really begrudge somebody if that's their option to have a little bit of money in retirement and some security and a nest egg, and nobody else wants to farm the land in the family, and new farmers can't afford to buy it at development prices to
Yeah.
farm it. You'd never farm your way out of that mortgage. So
No.
what do you do? I mean, there aren't that many options, but I think there are maybe some innovative programs like this one in the Bear River Valley that maybe are starting up, but I don't know. Will it be too little, too late? I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a tough topic. We'll take a little break, but when we get back, we'll talk more about your own background in farming and the development of your farm, and then also your position at the Department of Agriculture.
Great.
Okay. All right, on today's Utah Trails Report, we visit the Salt Lake Overlook Trail and beyond. So, the Salt Lake Overlook Trail is one of the most well-traveled trails in Mill Creek Canyon. I absolutely love it, but I love going the back route, and by that I mean going up Thanes Canyon and then looping around where you can connect to the trail beyond the Salt Lake Overlook Trail. And this is my favorite spot of the trail, where you have this expansive view of the pines and you're up against the mountain mahogany trees. They are my favorite trees in the Wasatch Front. They're these trees that only grow up in the rocks. And as you can see from this sort of panoramic view, it's just a stunning view. And if you're into sort of more heavy exercise and a lot of vertical feet, this is the place to go. It's a strenuous hike, but it is well worth it. If you've got, 4 hours, you can walk it the whole time. If you want to run it where it's, flat or either downhill, you can actually do it in about an hour and a half. And I did this to train for the Wasatch back, and it's a great workout, and the dogs love it, so I'd highly recommend it. All right, well, we're back, and so I wanted to find out, so did you get into farming before you got married, or when you saw your father-in-law in it, did that perk your interest, or how
So so my parents, my dad especially, were avid backyard gardeners, and so I grew up gardening and doing that kind of work, and sort of begrudging the fact that as a kid, 10, 12, 14-year-old kid, I got the grunt jobs of mowing and edging and those kind of hot and not very fun jobs, but I always wanted to do more of the planting and harvesting and those kind of things. So as I got older and got out on my own, I did more of that just as a hobby. I didn't do farming for money or commercially or whatever until I did marry into the family about 20 years ago. And at that time, my in-laws were still, I mean, they were 70, they're 90 now. So they were 70, 71 when Carrie and I got married, but they were still young and vital, and they did a lot of that. And my parents were a bit older than them and not as young and vital. So we spent a lot of our early time married helping take care of my parents until they passed away. Once they passed away, I had always really wanted to do more. I got to do like some of the big days during the year, like pruning in the spring and some of the big harvest days in the fall and some of that stuff with Carrie's family, but I didn't get to do it daily or weekly. So I just kind of went in like hog wild, I guess you'd say. And my sister used a weird term after my mother passed away, and I didn't here we were, these very, very adult people in our, late 30s or 40s, and she said we're orphans, and I didn't really think about it, but I guess maybe I was like looking for something else to do and something else to belong to and be part of, and this farm and farm family sort of was it. So I kind of went into it full bore and said, this great little orchard you have is all well and good, but if we want to be at farmers markets and do this right, we really need to grow more vegetables than you have it on your little victory garden. They've always had like a nice little quarter acre or so of gardens there, and we need to do more of this. So we converted more land to gardens. We converted more of the space to orchard. Spaced the trees a little closer together, just made the most of that we could. And then I went out and looked for other pieces of land that we could rent or borrow. And I found that combination of a few fields to lease and some backyards to essentially either lease or basically trade for vegetables or help them pay their water bill or whatever that looks like. And so I did all that while I still had a 40-hour a week job, and really got to the point where I just packed in my time. I wasn't looking for anything to do anymore. I had so much going on.
That sounds pretty busy.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden I started getting older, and this year I'll be at 30 years with my job at the state, and I'm looking at the possibility of retirement because I don't know how many more farm seasons I can do a 40-hour a week day job and then a 40 to 60-hour a week farm.
Yeah, that's crazy.
On top of it. And a lot of what we do is by hand because of the nature of it and the size and the scale. And so, I'm busy all the time, but it's such rewarding work, and I love it so much. And most of the money that we make, helps the in-laws have a nicer retirement and that kind of thing. We don't really take much money away from it at the end of the year. It's mostly the joy it brings me and them, and just the being kind of connected to to the dirt beneath their feet.
I think it's something that's kind of hard to describe once you have that kind of bug,
right?
But it's like something I got myself about 15 years ago when you just start growing rows of tomatoes and rows of cucumbers, and then you watch them grow and you learn how to do it vertically, and then you get so much food out of just a little space, and the tomatoes are so amazing, and you give them away to people, you start eating them and making your own salsa, and it's like, man, you just realize this is so much more fun than going golfing,
right?
Or just like typical leisure activities, so you kind of developed that farming bug and the green thumb pretty young, and you just
I was in in my 30s that I really started to be more of the avid or professional, if you will, grower, and but I really did come by it naturally from that young age, and I think that I really appreciate the fact that my father always had a great garden and had us working in the garden, and even if we got the weeding jobs and the edging and the mowing, and that's okay, because I look at it now and I think all of that stuff and that connection to the environment around us, even though it wasn't wild nature, it's still, you're sort of in tune with nature a little bit more even in the city, because you get more birds and you get various things there because you have a garden. And
do you do organic?
So everything we do is organically grown, even the tree fruit. We're not certified organic, but and that is another thing that I think people don't necessarily understand, is so little of our tree fruit is grown organically, and I think one of the main reasons for that is because of the amount of work it takes. It's more costly and it's much more labor intensive to grow fruit organically than it is to grow it with chemicals, and yet. The thing that I correct people on the most is when they ask at the farmer's market, they say, so do you spray? And I say, well, you're asking the wrong question, because what you mean to ask is, do we grow organically? Yes. And do we spray? Yes. Because you can't grow tree fruit without putting pesticides on the fruit. Yeah. But these are plant-based pesticides. Many of them are deterrents, not really even bug killers, but they... because they are plant-based and natural in their formulation, there's been a lot of studies to show that they don't harm human health. Now, whether other pesticides do or don't, I don't get into that. I don't care if people want to grow with pesticides and do it in a responsible manner. I think that's wonderful. But for me, with our kids and now a couple of grandkids running around, we want to just grow organically. And also, I sell 100% of my fruits and vegetables in direct sales, either to little restaurants or at farmers markets, and my clients want that.
Yeah.
So our people at the farmers markets that are our regular customers, that's what they want.
And what I've heard other farmers explain is if you're okay with having little wormholes in your cherries, then you can be okay then not spraying. But if you don't want the worms in your cherries, you got to spray.
So interestingly enough, I think that most of our customers, even though they want organic, when it comes to their cherries and their apples and their peaches, they also want them to be as blemish free and certainly bug free as possible. And so we do spray with insecticidal soaps and things like spinosad and those types of things to try to get the best of both worlds, but that comes at a cost.
Yeah.
Some of the sprays that are more the commercial sprays that are the non-organic sprays will have 10, 14, 17, even 21-day efficacy, so you can go that long between sprays. For us, we're doing 5 to 7 days between sprays.
Wow.
Yeah.
Huh.
And so
that's just because you're not using the hardcore stuff.
Right. The things that we use only last that long.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you practice like composting to keep your garden beds fertile?
So we compost, and I have to admit that in the little gardens in Salt Lake City, where Salt Lake City has a green waste can, which ironically is sort of a brown color, but that's okay. Their green waste can has been something I've actually done more throwing away, quote unquote, of garden waste because of that, because I know that goes to the landfill and is composted, and so somebody else is doing that for me. But out at the farm and the farm fields, we're composting all the time. We will also do, for garden health, we'll do things like cover cropping. So a cover crop may be something like a legume, a hairy vetch, or an Austrian field pea, or something like that fixes nitrogen into the soil. It may be a barley or something like that helps with...
Yeah, I just started doing that.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's great.
So the various types of crops you can grow that do different things. Some are weed suppressors, some aerate the soil better, some fix nitrogen to the soil. Then we also do rest rotation sometimes, but also crop rotation, where you've grown your tomatoes in one bed for a couple of years and now you move them somewhere else and you put something else in there, like a nitrogen fixing crop, even an edible one like sweet pea, regular peas, or beans, or something like that, that will give you the opportunity to get rid of any of the bacterias and the bugs that might be there, and also to build up the soil again.
Yeah, and I heard that if you have a springtime where there's plenty of sunlight and there's plenty of water, and you have bare ground, your soil's actually kind of oxidizing nutrients out of it. If there's not something covering your compost or your soil,
right?
Is that accurate?
Well, and there will a lot of the urban farmers will use mulches, the plastic coverings, or weed cloths or whatever, and they're doing a couple of things. They are doing that. They're keeping some of those nutrients in, but they're also trying to suppress weeds, because that becomes another thing that weeds will take up some of the nutrients as well as choke out some of your beneficial crops. So you have to be, it's kind of a 1-2 punch. If you can, a lot of guys I know, if they have the time and the ability, they'll actually prep their beds at the end of the year, at the end, we're all wanting that last harvest before it gets really cold and the snow flies. But as soon as they have to pull everything up, they'll pull it up. They'll turn their soil as minimally invasive, or they may till, whatever they do, and then they'll put their coverings over it for the winter and tap those down really well with bricks, with garden stakes, whatever they do. And then when they pull those off in the spring to prep that soil again, there's very little preparation that has to happen. You can minimally disturb it at the very most because you've suppressed a lot of the weeds, and then you've kept a lot of your nutrients in. Yeah. And so it depends on what you're doing and where. Sometimes you want to have a cover crop that overwinters. And so in that particular case, you want that crop to be able to live, so you're not going to cover it with black plastic or weed mat. So it depends on what you're doing, and we'll use different practices on different beds in different years and try to make sure that overall we have a fair percentage of our garden beds that we can continue to grow on when we want to and need to, but that we're also trying to do things to rebuild the soil health and keep the insects and the pests down low and the bacteria and all that at the same time.
Yeah, that's smart.
Yeah.
So do you have a lot of help with your gardens, or how much of it are you doing it yourself and your wife, or how much?
So we have. I like to say that it's surprisingly, my 90-year-old father-in-law and his 77-year-old brother do a lot of work. I mean, you'd be surprised how much work they can get done. We have one of my uncle's grandsons who goes to college at University of Utah. He'll help on the weekends. I have 2 or 3 young people that work for us part-time. One young lady who really wants to be a farmer is one of the things she does. And so she works at a coffee shop part-time. She's a yoga instructor part-time, and she works for me in the gardens part-time. And that's how she caught, and she's young and doesn't, and I think probably still covered on insurance with her parents and whatever, but she doesn't necessarily need all the things that people need as they get a little older and have families and those kind of financial security. And so she's able to cobble together a life that she really loves doing that. And so we have 2 or 3 people working 10 to 20 hours for us, and myself, I work 4/10, so I get my 4 days in Monday through Thursday, and then I work Friday through Sunday at various parts of the farm, including farmers markets a couple of days out of that, or parts of a couple of days. So it's a lot of work and not very many people doing it. And occasionally for big planting days, we can get family to come and help and friends to come and help. But as you can imagine, everybody has a busy life. And so they do like what I did back in the day when I was taking care of my parents. They would come out for those special days to help prune or to help harvest or to help plant.
Yeah.
And that's about, you'd see them 2-3 times a year, and that's about it.
Yeah, I witnessed on the Bangeter farm how he had just all of these kids after school just helping him plant at planting time. And I guess the same thing happens with harvest time.
Yeah, it does. And we have out at a field in West Valley City, we have some kids that live right on the back of the field. And it's the old historic Winder Dairy, and some of these Winder family members still have homes right there. And so, Mike Winder has a couple of kids who will come out and help weed and help plant and help do that kind of stuff when they're off school for the summer. And we do some of that. But I used to know, I've known people like Alan Bangeter and like Bill Rigby, who's passed away since then, but also in Davis County, they would use all the kids in the neighborhood every day.
And what a better
harvesting.
job to have a kid do at a young age, actually learn how to work and learn the value of using their body to grow food.
And we've been able to do a little of that, as I said, but I don't do that as much as those guys have. And so I've been really fortunate. I've been able to find people in their college age more, in their young 20s, who are interested in helping.
Yeah, they're probably a little more productive too.
And some of them have actually had farming experience in other places. So the one girl I was telling you about worked on a farm in Washington State before she moved back to Utah. And we've just picked up some help from a young lady who just moved here from New York State, and she worked on a farm in New York State when she was going to college. And so, you can't find those people all the time, but you're really lucky when you do, because you can just sort of start putting them to work, and you don't have to train them a bunch and work closely with them and hold their hand, quote unquote, for a while. You can just let them go and do the work. And there's something to be said for that. But even if it is 15, 16-year-old kids that you have to watch a little closer and show them how to do more things, yeah, wherever you can get your help from, I think is sort of our philosophy. We just do what we can, and that's one thing I think that people don't necessarily recognize about the small urban farms. They don't have the amount of work to do, or can't necessarily afford to bring in migrant farm workers like a lot of the larger farms can. And so you are just sort of cobbling it together, quite literally. Just this person works 2 hours here, and that person works 5 hours there, and you make it work somehow.
Yeah. Do you use like a tilther or tillers on your farm at all?
So we do a little bit of both. Johnny Seeds has this tilther that just goes down 2 inches, and I haven't invested in that yet. It's kind of pricey.
Yeah, it's pretty expensive.
Yeah,
I saw that too.
But we use what's called broad forks to do more minimal invasive kind of tilling of the ground. We will use tillers at sometimes. I know some of the guys that have gone a little bit more to a permaculture kind of a thing. They don't really till hardly at all. But the other thing we'll do is I'll use a manual device called a wheel hoe, and it's got a couple of handles, and you push it, and it has 2 or 3 different attachments. One is like the stirrup hoe, hula hoe attachment. That's just a blade that kind of just will cut an inch under the soil or so. Has the little cultivating teeth that will go down a couple of inches, and it will stir up all the ground, but it'll just do it down at the about 2-inch level.
So it's like a tilther.
Yeah, it's like a tilther, but you are totally pushing that yourself.
Oh yeah.
And it's
getting a workout.
Yeah, you're getting a workout. Yeah, and I really like that particular device, and it's the other thing that I tell people. I say, you guys, you spend all this money when I'm trying to market to my friends, come and help a little bit more. It's like, you guys spend all this money on gym memberships or building your gym up in your basement at home, your home gym. And it's like, just tell me which muscle group you want to work.
Yeah.
And I will put you to work on the farm building that set of muscles.
Yeah,
because
that's exactly
you can totally
right.
do it. And so for me, that is my gym. That's my workout. I used to do, like you said, golf, but I used to do mountain biking and hiking. I don't do very much of that anymore. I don't have the time.
Yeah.
But I still get the workout. And in the winter, I either have to go to the gym or put on that freshman 15 pounds, but in the wintertime, and then I take it back off in the summer because it's that much work and it's that hard. But it's rewarding. And it's good.
It's just great.
Yeah.
And I either decide, okay, this spring I'm going to plant a huge garden, and I'll end up losing weight doing that, or I'll decide I'm going to do this summer I'm doing a big trail run race. So I'm racing a lot in the mountains, but people, I don't think they recognize it. They look at like the physical labor aspect of it, and they don't realize you can expend your calories out in your garden, and you can actually get in great shape, and you can grow your food.
Right. And one thing I tell people too is I think it's our society. I think we all have a tendency to do this is, so you have a small backyard garden, and you go out and buy a big tiller to put in that garden, and that's fine. That's a great option for some people, but you have the option to then buy one of those wheel hoes like I have, or just use shovels and hose, and you can get so much exercise doing that. And I don't think it would ever replace, like if you're doing a big competitive run, you probably need to do very specific type of training, and it's not going to replace that. But for just staying in basic shape, you can totally do that on the farm, a small farm, or even in a nice garden.
Yeah.
So, for me, that's how I've done it.
Yeah, I think it's like a lost, forgotten method of staying happy and healthy, because I also believe that you do develop a connection with the soil, and this whole idea of that the soil has its own microbiome, and we have our own microbiome in our gut, and you can enrich both by putting your effort to use that way.
Well, I think you can, and then I think the food you tend to eat from your garden is healthier, certainly. Well, that helps as well. But there's also that emotional or mental health that I think I personally have gotten from my garden. And I know that I've done better as I've gotten older, but I used to have to use one of those lights in the wintertime that people have to use to keep from having seasonal affective disorder, because I would just, kind of get into a funk when all the light went away or the inversion came in, and
Yeah.
it would be days where you just didn't see the sun and I wasn't being very active and all that kind of stuff. And so I think being in the garden or being on the farm does all of that for you. You get the vitamin D. I certainly am a believer in sunscreen and hats and covering your skin, but you still get that natural sunlight. You get the opportunity to work up a sweat and get your heart going a little bit, and then you have that great food to eat. And I
Yeah.
think that can't be bad, right? I think it's got to be healthy for you.
I've seen it,
Yeah.
like it says that literally gardening helps produce creativity, like in your brain.
And I'm not surprised about that. I don't think of myself as the most like artistically creative person in the world, and we grow everything in straight rows, but I also think you're thinking on your feet and trying to figure out new ways to do things in the
Innovation.
yeah. Yeah.
And talk a little bit about what your work has been in the Department of Agriculture for the last 30 years.
So I do public relations, public affairs work for them, and I've been doing that for most of my 30-year career with the state, just under 30. But it's been really good and really rewarding because I've had an opportunity to work in various programs. I worked in the conservation and water quality program for a while, working with farmers and ranchers that were trying to rehabilitate streams and move feed yards away from the rivers and the slopes and those kinds of things. And that was really great to see people who they were just doing things the way they had been done in previous generations, and they got caught in a situation where then EPA regulations got more stringent, and they need to make changes. And so these were guys who were just trying to, still make a living, but do what was right for the time they lived in. And so they made a lot of changes. And I've worked with more urban farming in the last few years, and something called the Local Food Advisory Council that was created by the legislature a couple of years ago. I've been helping staff that. And so it's been really nice. I've been able to stay in touch with the people that grow our food for us, as well as, being one of those myself when I leave work. And it's been a really rewarding career. I've really enjoyed it.
That's awesome. So what's the Local Food Advisory Council? What do you guys do?
So Representative Steve Handy and Senator Gene Davis started that. It was a law passed by the legislature, and what they do basically is we look at what's going on in agriculture for everything from ag land preservation to distribution. So a lot of the momentum to try to get a local food hub in Utah is coming from the Local Food Advisory Council. Now, a lot of that was started at local levels, like in Salt Lake County, Salt Lake City, the Urban Food Connections of Utah. Those people really were pushing on food hubs even before the Local Food Advisory Council started. But now it's got a little bit more momentum with it, a little bit more weight. And when you think about it, and then whether it be talking about innovative production techniques like high tunnels and hydroponics, aquaponics, like we talked about, or distribution techniques like the food hub, or the local produce incentives. So, if you've ever heard of like Double Up Food Bucks, that was something that Representative Handy took to the legislature this past year because of members of the council that come from the Department of Health who said, we really need help with this program. It's running out of private funding. And so it allows people who are on SNAP funding to be able to get additional money each week. They take their Horizon card, they spend $10 or $20, and they swipe that, and then they're given an additional $10 or $20 to spend just on local produce only. And so it really increases their buying power at a farmer's market.
Yeah, that's great.
It helps, obviously, with all those health issues that we talked about. But the Food Council's been able to do stuff like that, and they're really pushing this idea of the food hub. And then one of the other things that their initiatives they're working on is we're working with the State Board of Education to try to get an incentive program, this sort of run as a grant program out of the state office to local school district food buyers to buy more local ingredients in their food for the food service for not only schools but after school and daycare and those kind of things.
Yeah,
summer
that
programs.
seems like a no-brainer.
Yeah, right.
Make school lunch a lot more healthy.
So that's one of the things that the council is pushing this coming year in the legislative session is to get that program funded. And so it's been a real neat opportunity because we have been able to work with other agencies that I haven't worked with historically at Department of Ag. I have never really spent a lot of time working with the State Board of Education or even maybe in one area of the health department, but now I'm working with a different area of the health department. And so it's been really a lot of fun doing that and being part of that kind of momentum, I hope, that we're creating to get people thinking more seriously about a local food system.
Yeah, and the idea of the local food hub is something that we talked about before we started, but explain what that is and why you feel like it's so important. We have that here in Salt Lake.
So at its most basic level, a food hub is just a locally sourced aggregator. And by aggregator, we mean there might be 20 different farms supplying fruits, vegetables, meats, dairy, etc., to a central warehouse that then in turn ships that out to restaurants, to grocery stores, to hospital commissaries, to businesses that have cafeterias and commissaries on site. And those folks are then taking that food and using it, and even grocery stores. Well, it sounds a little bit like what the traditional distributors do, but those traditional distributors are mostly getting their food from out of state and even sometimes out of country sources. Mm-hmm. And so the food hub is usually run by local people, sourced by local farms, and then supplies local distribution points. And in fact, in some cases, one business model for a food hub is a farmer co-op owned food hub. And so the actual farmers that are supplying the food are actually owning the distribution business as well. And so, but that's not the only model. There are nonprofit models. There are for-profit businesses that will do it. One of the challenges with the food hub is it tends to have a lower profit margin than some businesses. So it doesn't necessarily attract venture capitalists as much if it's got a maybe 1% to 2% profit margin to start, or might take 3 years to break even, and then you might work your way up to like a 5% profit margin. And anyone that knows much about businesses and that's not great from a venture capital standpoint compared to what certain sectors of the economy can bring.
So the idea that you're playing around with right now, or that's looking like it's taking shape, is through the Sapa family, and are they investing it, or are they donating some of their land and property to the idea, or what's their involvement?
Well, I really, I can't really speak for them too much, but in the meetings that I've been to and some of my colleagues have been to, I think their idea is to use land that they own and or that they lease to be kind of a multi-venue sort of a thing. I think they want to have several different revenue streams coming in so that they can sort of afford to do the food hub as a more break-even or lower income kind of a thing, sort of a way to give back, if you will, I think. Okay. A little bit, because to the farmers that have helped them be successful in their restaurants, they want to give them more opportunities to be able to distribute locally, and so I think they're doing that. But from what I understand, they are looking at maybe having like a public market, like you might see in cities like Seattle, like Pike Place Market and those kind of things, where people have more permanent stalls that they're selling. There's other things I've heard that they might be doing with some of the space to bring in money and revenue, and then this food hub will be able to be there as well. But as I said, they're not typically on their own big money makers, so it's just becomes part of or one of the revenue streams for the property that they're looking at using.
And their incentive, I'm sure, would be they could probably help facilitate getting more local farm and food in their restaurants and probably get more restaurants to use the same farmers they use. And
I can certainly see all of that happening. And so, anyway, but like I say, I can't really speak for them. But what I do know is then what we're trying to do then at the local food advisory council is we're trying to work on getting some money dedicated to a one-time grant program, if you will, for seed money or startup capital for a food hub. Depending on what you need to do in terms of space, if you need to lease and renovate a warehouse or whatever that might look like, it could easily take $3 million to get a food hub off the ground. Mm-hmm. And so we're talking about a very small, $250,000 grant program that may go all to one applicant, or it might go to a couple of different applicants. But the other thing about food hubs is they're very much a regional, local kind of a model. They're not bringing in, like we say, they're not bringing in food from several states away, but they're also not distributing it out 200 or 300 miles in a state like ours, which is still a bit of a lower population, but we're pretty big geographically. We're like 12th or 15th geographically in terms of land mass, land size. So it makes sense to maybe have 2 or 3 or 4 food hubs within the state to be those regional models.
Yeah.
And so that you're kind of keeping it close to home. You're picking it more ripe, and it's fresher when it gets to the restaurant or the grocery store or whatever.
And you said that those exist in most other states, but we don't have one here in Utah, just because it's not been something that the government's ever made a big priority. Is that the reason why? And
you have to remember that food hubs are private businesses, and I'm not sure that what we're trying to do is unprecedented, but a government grant program to start food hubs does tend to happen in the federal level, like there are USDA monies available to nonprofits or agricultural co-ops that want to start food hubs, but I'm not sure how many people are doing it at the state level. But I think that what you're seeing is a lot of it has to do with the community and the local food systems, and I think that Utah, and this is my personal opinion, but I think that Utah has always been a little bit behind the curve when it comes to trends in food.
Yeah.
And especially like those local food type of trends. Like you go to places like Portland and Seattle, and we'll never be a Portland or Seattle, but they're always way ahead of us when it comes to certain trends in whether it be organic or buying local or farmers markets. But the other flip side of that is national stats show you that, actually the number of farmers markets may be decreasing a little bit, or the interest in local maybe is leveled out. But in Utah, it's still really on the rise because maybe we are a little bit
we're a little behind the curve.
Yeah. But I think what you're going to see is I think there's an opportunity now for us to get a food hub where we haven't had one before.
Yeah, that'd be very cool.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's probably good. I think we've covered the bases. So if people want to get more involved in helping farmers, besides just going to the farmers market and helping to preserve farms, is there anything else you would recommend that they do?
Well, I think if you want to help preserve farms, if you want to help maybe save farm ground, I would certainly consider looking for land trust organizations like Utah Open Lands or the Bear River Land Conservancy. I think that may be their title, that may be their whole name, but there are those groups out there that are involved in that. I would say the number one thing I think people can do is patronize local farms and food businesses. Mm-hmm. That's the way to keep it going, because even if you go out and buy salsa, for example, if it's a local salsa that's sold mostly at the farmers markets, or maybe it's in a few store shelves, but it's a local company, chances are they're sourcing a lot of their raw product from Utah. Yeah. Those onions and tomatoes and whatever else are coming from local farms. And so you have that really nice collaborative between the food businesses and the farms, where a lot of food businesses aren't going to be able to source very much or all of what they grow. Like if you're a local baker, you might be able to get some of your flour from Lehigh Roller Mills or Honeyville Grains or one of those places. But you still, they're doing what they can to source locally.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
a guy we've written about, Salsa del Diablo. He partners with all these local
he's bought from
tomato
me before.
farmers.
Yeah,
and he does. Oh, I think he does almost all local ingredients.
I think Daniel just does buy 100% local when he can.
Yeah.
And Salsita Mendoza, the same thing, but not just salsa companies. A lot of whoever, whatever products they're making, if they can source locally, they will, I think, a lot of times. And that seems to be part of that local food system.
Yeah.
It's
awesome what you're doing. So,
Thank you.
And thanks a lot for coming on the program, Jack.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah. And so people can find you at the downtown Salt Lake Farmers Market.
So I'm not doing downtown this year. Next year when I retire, I will be back down at downtown Farmers Market. Right now I'm at the Liberty Park Market on Friday nights.
Okay.
And Wheeler Farm Market on Sundays.
All right. Sounds good. Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Utah Stories program. Be sure to visit us online at utahstories.com. Follow us on Instagram. That's where we're the most active. And our production managers are Drew Pecan and Connie Lewis. Next time on the program, a conversation with Carl Fischer, the executive director of Save Our Canyons. Very interesting conversation about the environmental policy of preserving and protecting the canyons along the Wasatch Front. So I hope you'll join us next time. Until then, this is Richard Markosian. Thanks for watching.